Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf begins with a Mishnah. That's the last 4 lines on Daf Nun Zayin. The subject of the Daf is how you measure the Tchumen, the actual methods used for measuring the Tchumen. As we shall see, we use ropes. The Gemara will discuss what kind of ropes, what length specified in the Mishnah, how you hold it, what material it's made out of. And the primary subject here is what happens when you get to hills. How do you measure across the hills and across the valley? So as we shall see, there are a number of different methods of doing this. You could possibly measure the slope of the hill, and therefore the slope will add to the distance of the ground. This will do when it's a very shallow hill or very shallow valley. It's not steep at all, and we'll include it in the actual measurements of the valleys itself. Our Mishnah and our Daf are primarily discussing where it's steeper than that, and there's a couple different ways of doing it. One way is to just run the rope straight across the top of the valley or straight across the bottom of the hill and not count the slopes at all. We would just therefore measure if it's long enough for us to be able to extend the rope from one side to the other. We would completely ignore the up and the down of the valleys or the hill, and we would just go straight across. That is what the Gemara calls measuring by the ear. Another way of doing it, which is a bit more difficult to do, which we'll resort to when we have to, is what the Gemara calls drilling. Drilling means you use a shorter rope, and somebody holds it by his chest, and the other person goes a ways up the hill, and he holds it by his feet. Now, this way, the rope is pretty much horizontal, and you're only measuring the horizontal span of the mountain or of the valley, and you have to do this in steps, one horizontal chunk at a time, and then you move further up the hill, and you do the next horizontal chunk of it. The idea is that you keep the rope as horizontal as you can, so it's from the person who's lower on the hill. It's from his head or his chest to the person who's higher on the hill to his feet. That way you're only really measuring horizontally, you're not really measuring too much of the vertical, adding to the length. As we shall see, this rope can't be greater than 4 amas, and therefore you are sometimes going to have to measure some of the vertical will be included in it if it's too steep, but as we shall see, this limits how much space you're losing in the vertical. Other than that, sometimes the Mishnah will give you a kula and allow you to just estimate, not have to actually measure it. And then sometimes you're actually going to have to measure, you'll have to ignore the walls of the valley and just drop down into the floor of the valley or up to the top of the mountain and measure the actual length of the floor and ignore what you lose in the walls. The Mishnah will spell out some of these halachos, and the Gemara will clarify when you're allowed to use which method of measuring. So first of all, the Mishnah says that you should always use a rope that's 50 amas long, not longer and not shorter. You should always hold it at your chest. You should not hold it higher or lower. That's always the way you do it. Now, as far as measuring across hills or valleys, the Mishnah mentions the method of going straight across the top of the valley or straight across a hilltop or a fence that collapsed and left you a pile of rubble in the way. You can go straight across. This is what the Mishnah gives you, that halacha. It doesn't tell you the other times when you don't do that. The Gemara will fill that in. And the Gemara says, what happens when you actually can't get across? The rope is only 50 amas long. What happens when the space is, the valley you're trying to measure across is greater than 50 amas wide, or the hill is more than 50 amas wide? So it says you can actually go to the side. You can go further along the length of the valley, keeping a straight line, and measure where it's shorter and adding where the width of the valley is shorter, and you can get across, and then adding the space from your straight line that you were walking till the edge of the valley so that you can measure it. And just you have to be careful, you can't go past the actual tchum of the city. You can go past being directly in front of the city. You can go past the borders of the city in order to be able to do that, but you can't go past the tchum of the city. The Gemara will explain, we don't want people to think that the tchum goes actually as far as you are going to go if they're watching you measuring. They think, hey, why is he measuring all the way down there? It must be that that's within the tchum itself. Now, the Gemara now brings Rabbi Distai, who says that you can't measure, it's for whatever reason you can't measure straight across, then you use the steps method, where you use a 4 amma long rope, and one person holds it by his chest and the other one holds it by his feet, and in this sense you measure 4 amas at a time, you measure the horizontal spread of the mountain or of the valley. So first, the Gemara discusses the sources of these halachas and what type of rope or material we're supposed to use here. So where first of all says what's the source, and where it says when describing the Mishkan, it says V'reichav chamishim b'chamishim. The width of the Mishkan was 50 by 50. The Mishkan was actually 50 by 100, but in describing the 50 amma width, it calls it 50 by 50. Chamishim b'chamishim. So where it says chamishim b'chamishim means you measure 50 ammas with a 50 amma. With a 50 amma long rope, that's what you're supposed to use. The Gemara says, what do you mean you can't use that extra b'chamishim for that? Well, you already use that extra b'chamishim to tell us that when you measure the karfeif, which is 5,000 square ammas, you do it by making one even-sided square of 70 2/3 ammas. That's what we do with chamishim b'chamishim. You take the 50 amma by 50 amma square and you spread the other 50 amma by 50 amma square around it in a way that you end up with an equal 70 2/3 amma square. So you can't use it for what you want it. It's not extra. Somewhere says, well, if your only halacha that you needed it for was the 70 2/3 amma square to determine the width of a karfeif, then I could just say chamishim. Chamishim b'chamishim is the extra basis to tell me that you use a rope 50 ammas long when you're measuring tchumen. Okay, now the Mishnah said you can't use a shorter rope or a longer rope. The Gemara explains you can't use a shorter rope because you can end up stretching it, which means you're going to end up adding too many ammas onto the tchum. You can't use a shorter rope because you can't use a longer rope because it's going to sag, and you'll use up some of the rope length in the valley that it sags, and therefore you're going to end up measuring a shorter tchum, and you'll lose out space from what you should have been using. Now, what's this rope supposed to be made out of? Rabbi says it should be made out of afsakima. Gemara says, what is that? Rabbi Abba, according to one version, and Rabbi Yaakov, according to the other version, said that's something called nargila. And what is that? So again, Rabbi Abba and Rabbi Yaakov, I'm not sure which one said it. It's actually something called nevara. It's a plant which grows as a vine around palm trees, and you have only one of them growing at a time. That's the material that you're supposed to use. And where it says, what's the source that you're supposed to use ropes here? So Rabbi Shua ben Chanani says, actually, logically, the best thing you should have used is a chain, because that doesn't stretch and that doesn't sag. But you can't, because in the Navi Yecheskel describing the measurements of the Beis HaMikdash, he says, Uviyadei chevel mida, there was a rope of measurement. So you see, he's supposed to use ropes to measure. So when he says, what do you mean? He also says, Biyadei knei hamida. He also had a measuring stick. Maybe we should use a stick. Versus the measuring stick is for very small things, like the width of a doorway or of a gate. That's where you use a measuring stick. You want to measure long lengths, like 50 ammas. For that, you use a rope. The Gemara quotes a Brisa, says there are 3 types of ropes that are discussed in halacha. Rope made out of magog, which is reeds. That's what you use for measuring. That's what you use for tying up the para aduma, because it's not makabel tuma, and you have to be careful with the para aduma not to be metameid. Next type of rope is called a rope of nitzarim. That's what's used for tying the top of the clothing of a saita after it's ripped, so that it shouldn't fall and expose her too much. You see, because there it says chevel hamitzri. Chevel hamitzri means this one made out of nitzarim. This is made of peeled aravis branches, and the last one is made out of pishtan, flax. That's the one that she used for actually measuring lengths of 50 ammas like these tchumen. Okay, now as far as measuring over a valley or a mountain or a fence that fell, the Gemara now discusses the specifics of which method of measuring you use. So first of all, the Gemara wants to analyze the Mishnah. The Mishnah had not spelled out clearly the way we explained it. The Mishnah said when you want to measure across the valley, but the valley is too wide, so you measure across the valley, it said, and then you go back to your original measuring line. It didn't spell out what the Gemara says it means, which is here is where it explains it and brings a price that spells it out, that you can move further along to the left, to the right, along the valley until you find a place where it's narrow enough, and you measure in a line parallel to your original line of measurement, and you measure the space there, and you add the spaces that you had to move off your line of measuring, and then you go back to continuing to measure on the line that you are measuring up till now. And that way it all works out. So the Gemara brings a brisa that spells that out. And then the Gemara says, what do you do if this method isn't going to work? Why would this not work? Let's say the valley you're trying to measure actually bends around the city. Now you can't go to the side and measure it because you don't have a straight line. You can't move in a straight line. You don't have a way to get across until you're measuring in a different direction altogether. You're trying to measure this direction of the city, not when it bends around to the other side of the city. So therefore there's no way to measure across. So what do you do then? You have to use the steps method. So then the Brisa adds, and if you have a wall that fell down, you don't have to actually measure across the top, you could just estimate it. So this is what I mean, you could just estimate it. We said in the Mishnah explicitly that you have to measure across the top. You know how to just estimate. So this depends how steep it is. If it's steep enough that people could walk over it, then you should measure it across the top. If it's not so steep, if it's steeper than that, and then nobody is going to walk over the top, then you're allowed to just measure it. You don't have to, you could just estimate it. You don't have to measure directly across the top of it. Nobody's going to use it anyway. Now, as far as measuring the valley, so we had said that you use either go across the top or you use the steps method. So if Yehuda says the name of Shmuel, that's only if the valley wall is not straight down. It has to, if it actually stretches out, if it moves sideways, it's sloped, so it moves sideways at least 4 amas from the top to the bottom. If it's straight down, so then what you do is you just measure the top and you measure the bottom, and you don't worry about whatever space you lose in the slope as long as it's less than 4 amas, the actual width of the slope. And the Gemara says that's a valid approach. Now, how deep can this valley be? And you can measure it that way. So Rav Yosef says up to 2,000 amas. So the Gemara asks, Abaye asks, there's a brisa that says it can only be up to 100 amas. So Gemara says actually machlokes tanoim. Acherim say that it's 2,000 amas, and the Tanakama there says that it's 100 amas. Different version of this conversation had Rav Yosef saying even more than 2,000 amas, and that doesn't fit not with a cherem and not the Tanakama. Gemara says, how could you do that? So Gemara says there machlokes was only referring to where you couldn't measure the top and the bottom because the slope sloped sideways more than 4 amas. If the slope slopes sideways more than 4 amas, then you're limited to the shear that they gave. If, however, it's straight down, or at least it's less than 4 amas of a slope, the width of the slope, then you could just measure the top and the bottom, and you don't have a problem. All these options allow you to measure just the width of the mountain without having to actually measure up and down the slope. So Gemara says, Rava said that that's only if the rise of the slope was steep enough that it was at least 10 tvachim over 4 amas. But if it was shallower than that, for example, if it was 10 tvachim up over 5 amas width, then you couldn't measure just straight across using either of the methods we discussed above. You have to actually measure along the slope because it's so easy, it's such a shallow slope that people just walk up and down it, and therefore you have to include the rise in the measure of your tchum. Now, a different version of this had Rava saying l'kula. He said when it's a rise of 10 tvachim over 5 amas, that's where you can measure the width across the top or using the step method. If it's steeper than that, if it's a rise of 10 tvachim over 4 amas, then you don't even have to do that. You can go more l'kula than that, and you can just estimate how far and how wide the actual slope is, and that's enough. The Gemara goes further and explains a few additional halachas in the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that you shouldn't move along the valley to measure across the top to the left or to the right outside the actual tchum. The Gemara says, why not? The Gemara explains that somebody might see and think that the tchum actually extends to there, and therefore you should be careful not to go where the tchum actually does not extend. Now it explains how you do the steps method. You have one person goes up the mountain away and he holds the rope at his feet, and the other one a little bit further lower along the mountain than him holds it at his chest, and that way the rope is somewhat horizontal. You can't, however, use a longer rope than 4 amas, so if it becomes steep enough, the rope will have to be angled, but at least it won't be angled as steeply as the mountain itself. Now, as far as these methods, you can't use them for egel arufa. When you're trying to measure the space, the distance from the person that you found to the nearest city, you cannot use the steps methods. That's a measurement d'oraisa. These halachos are all special kulas given for measurements that are midrabanan. Same thing applies for a miklat. The tchum of an ir miklat counts as an ir miklat itself to protect the person who runs into it. So you have to measure those tchum, and that's also d'oraisa, and you cannot use this kula, these lenient ways of measuring for that halacha either. This ends the Gemara, which takes us to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says you only are allowed to measure if you're an expert. You have to only rely on an expert measurer. If you find a tchum that's marked, and it's marked not evenly, in one corner it's marked to one length, and in a different corner it's marked to a different length, you could go with the larger marking. You could assume that in the smaller corner he didn't stretch it properly, and therefore the larger midah is the correct one. Then this Mishnah seems to repeat this halacha. It says a very similar halacha in just different words. The Gemara will explain what the extra halacha is teaching us. And it says, if you don't know where the tchum is, you're allowed to rely on anybody who could tell you that I've seen the signs here, or I've seen people walking up till here, even allowed to trust an Eved or a Shevcha for that halacha. And the reason is because all these halachas of tchumen we go l'kula, they're all Rabbanan, and therefore we are lenient in all of these. That takes us to the end of the Mishnah and the end of the...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com. Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.